Righty. Oh man, welcome to This is Crucial. In This month is March. This is Crucial, where we gather monthly for conversations on healing justice and racial equity. I am Amos DeSasa. I'm the pastor here at the First Presbyterian Church of Dallas. Before I do turn it over to my co-host and friend Charlene, just one quick reminder that you are invited to post your questions, your comments, your reflections as you listen tonight in the chat mechanisms in Facebook or YouTube, whichever one you're using. You can use those messages to contact us, and we will do our best to get to as many questions and comments that come in tonight. Well, Charlene, tell us who our guest is tonight.
So hello, folks. I'm Charlene. I am the senior pastor at First Pres Berkeley. And so my sincere hope is that we have some people joining us tonight who've never actually tuned in before and are curious about these crucial conversations. I just noted actually that it has been officially 1 year since we started this conversation. And so it feels very special and appropriate that our 1 year celebratory guest is my dear, beloved, like my heart just wants to explode whenever I think or see this person, Zach Fredman, who I have known now, gosh, I think it's going on 12 years since we traveled together as young seminarians, pre-jobs in shuls and synagogues and organizations, pre-marriage, pre-children. And so we knew each other then. But Zach is a rabbi, he's an artist, he is an amazing musician, and he's a dear friend, as I said earlier. He is currently serving as the director, and he's the founder of the Temenos Center for the Arts based in New York. And prior to that, he served as a rabbi for a decade at the New Shul in New York City. And when he's not doing, all of that important work, he's also composing music and leading this amazing, playing the oud and leading his amazing band, the Epichorus. And for all of you who are listening or watching, immediately when you log off of this, Google them, add them to your Spotify play, find them however and whenever you can, and listen to the amazing sounds of the Epichorus. When I met Zach, he was getting his master's in Midrash and scriptural interpretation at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And then final thing, because I just love boasting on you, is that kind of similar to my friendship with Amos, I guess I just rediscovered the wonder that is Zach via social media during this distance time in the pandemic. And so I started subscribing to all of his stuff, his email letters, his music, anything that I could get my hands on. And over the past few years, Zach has become my rabbi. He is a person who, when I am feeling like a loss of faith or hope, he restores that for me, or he says something profound. And I've often used quotes from his journals and emails in my own sermons. And so it feels like just a great honor to be in conversation with you today. So thank you, Zach.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you both for having me. I can't wait to dig into all the things we're going to talk about.
Zach, I echo Charlene's welcome and excitement that you're here with us tonight. I must say, let's go ahead and get started. As I mentioned earlier, This is Crucial is an ongoing conversation about healing justice and racial equity. Can you tell us what those conversations on those subjects have sounded like in your faith community over the last 2 years specifically?
It's been a really interesting time, kind of in the Jewish community and in the world, but some of the particularities of the Jewish story have made for some unique and profound reckonings. Two of the moments that jump to mind, the first was after there was a shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and I think there'd been shootings at churches, whether it was months or years before, and a lot of people, it must be like this in church too, that, when the world is shaking, people show up to sanctuary. There'll be, the numbers will double, and it's beautiful that we as pastors and religious leaders and centers can be places for when the world is shaking, people show up. And so the synagogue was packed that night, and people were you could feel the fear of, it's dangerous to show up to sacred space as a Jew. And we're in New York. It's very kind of multicultural, and you don't really think of that often. But that night, you had that, and I grew up. The Jewish community has this distinction between Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews. So the Ashkenazi Jews, that community, they were in Eastern Europe, and the Sephardi Jews were in mostly Muslim-ruled countries, North Africa, Iraq, Syria, Egypt. And so, I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, in the Ashkenazi Jewish community, which can basically pass as white. Those are like white Jews. And the Sephardic communities is less so. Egyptian Jews, Syrian Jews, North African Jews, darker. And I had no racial education growing up in the Jewish community, and so there was this sense that moment that what Jews, white Ashkenazi Jews, we couldn't pretend that we weren't benefiting from whiteness. Like, whiteness wasn't spoken about. Even, that Judaism occupies a weird space, being a profound minority and being persecuted in some ways. So there's that aspect of it, but there's also this privilege of whiteness that the Jewish community had really been using it. And that night, to me, represented a turning point where we began saying, look, we need to talk about the unique space that Judaism occupies here, and that it can't be just an unspoken thing anymore. So that was one moment. The other piece was, it's been a very profound time going through the pandemic, and then the uprisings following the murder of George Floyd. I guess it's now 2 summers ago. Time is also very strange. And when I was, kind of tracking the movements of the world, there was that summer, and then this past summer there was a bombardment in Gaza. There's in Israel and Palestine, and there's these like minor wars in Israel, Palestine every couple of years. But this one was really different for certain segments of the Jewish community, profoundly because we had witnessed the transformation and understanding and shift in the way the American Jewish community was thinking about race. And so now watching this destruction of Gaza was very different. There was something very different about watching police violence and then watching army violence, and so those are kind of 2 moments that represent, really kind of enormous shifts compared to, what my childhood was like, where just certain things were so not spoken of, that you didn't give it a second thought. And now all of a sudden, all these things were like, oh, wait, not speaking about this is actually really not okay.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I think I don't know, I'm excited about where the kind of overlaps are in our communities. In some ways, I think we can become very segregated in our religious communities. But for me, my inspiration and my path to becoming a rabbi was through the studying of the other faith traditions. And so I know those 2 settings are kind of in some ways unique to Judaism, but I'm excited to hear from each of you, where you see the overlaps coming.
Well, I mean, absolutely. I think I'll just name the fact that you are our first non-Christian guest. right? And so I think this podcast was born because with a hopeful desire to have real conversations, honest conversations around healing justice and racial equity, but underneath that is also admitting that there's a problem with injustice and racial violence. And so, which means we're all coming to these conversations just kind of already tender or ready to be like really othered, distanced from each other. Segregated was the word that you used. And so, I mean, I think there was, even in disagreement, there was a safety in us having our guests all be Christian, because we all came to this Zoom box, virtual conversation, blah, 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 with common language. And we could at least start from that point and then kind of venture out into the scary land of race and racial identity and all of those things, which I don't think that I could have had the awarenesses of the overlaps 10 years ago or 12 years ago, prior to when we met, because Zach and I went to Israel and the West Bank together with 9 Jewish seminarians, 9 Christian seminarians. So the first segregation was based upon religion, but then there were segregations within each group, right? There were Orthodox, conservative, Reform Jews. On the Christian side, it was less theological spectrum and more racial. So it was white Christian seminarians, Black Christian seminarians, and then me, the one non-Black or white Christian seminarian. And so in my ignorance, when I went there, I was kind of, if I had heard what you had said, just your first answer to this question would have helped me a lot. Just process those 2 weeks in Israel.
Right. On that trip, there was no addressing of basically there first of all were no Sephardic, there were no non-white Jews on the trip, and there was no discussion of the whiteness or non-whiteness of Jews.
It was crazy. I mean, I remember literally having conversations where I was like, wait, do you not see yourself as white? Because I do, because in fact, I found my point of connection. I found my point of connection with the Jewish participants as a Korean American, and not as a Christian with a Christian seminarian with a Jewish seminarian. So it was more around national and cultural ethnic identity than anything else. The religious piece was like, I couldn't even begin, like that was secondary, tertiary to all of these things. And it was mind blowing to me, because you're exactly right. Like that wasn't spoken. And yet there was also a fear of violence against the Jewish people that is shared by people of color, right? So I'll give the example that we've talked about, Zach, is when we went to Yad Vashem.
The Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Yeah. And on the huge block letters on the wall of Yad Vashem, maybe it's the entrance or the exit, it says "never again." I think those words are in every Holocaust museum, right?
Yeah, that's like I don't know what you'd call it. It's a theme, a motto, a meditation. I mean,
right.
But the piece that you're about to share with us is really profound. So I'm excited.
Well, and literally, I was just deer in headlights on that trip. I had no idea. That was probably one of the most profoundly painful trips of 2 weeks of my entire life. So I remember we were meeting with one of the people who was like, had planned and built this internationally known Holocaust museum. And so I asked the question, I said, does never again mean never again will a genocide happen to any people or to the Jewish people? And that thought had never occurred to me before. I always assumed it meant never again will there be a genocide of any people. But as I was listening to the presentation, I was like, oh, I think that might not be what they meant. And yeah.
So that debate is one of the fissures of the Jewish community, that and I think some of the ways to contextualize it is that, look, the Jewish story is of a long, long history of persecution You have the Holocaust then that's really just 3 generations ago. And so the traumas of persecution are in Jewish blood and bones and psyche, the stories of grandparents and how they were with food, how they were with, leaving the house, like all the kind of eccentricities of what was spoken about, not spoken about. The trauma is literally in Jewish bodies, and mostly, strangely, Ashkenazi Jewish bodies, the white Jewish bodies. The Holocaust didn't touch the communities further east in the same way. But so some of the answers to that question is we've got to be concerned about us. This is about like keeping Jewish people alive. We have to be concerned about our community, and when that feels safe, maybe then our compassion will be able to extend further. But for now, and then you've got this other, segment of the community that I'd consider myself a part of that says, look, the world's in a different place now, and it's hard to convince people that have, where trauma like that really lives. I can feel it as I'm speaking it, but that I think the world is at the edge, at the precipice of a kind of a different understanding that says living the ethos of we have to care about everyone, regardless of any of the identities, and we have to fight for their equality, well-being, joy, happiness, all these things, as much as we're fighting for our own. Never again, of course, applies everywhere. That's the way to best live our Jewish values. And so that kind of, and this is how healing plays out, that it works at different paces. You can't, I don't know, I'm intrigued by that question of the pace of healing and the steps, what are the rituals and the things that make for healing, both on the personal and on the cultural plane.
I mean, I think from a medical point of view, there's stages of healing. Like our bodies don't just heal overnight, right? And we acknowledge there are multiple stages to that. And I wonder, based upon, and I mean, you talk about generations, and I actually even have quotes of beautiful things that you've written about. We come from legacies, personal and cultural, in need of repair. And the linearity of time says that the wounds of our youth and the youths of our ancestors are with us forever. But you say, but it's not so. Like a tree stretching for growth into the thick dark of the earth, the eyes lead us astray. Another kind of seeing past surfaces and simple dichotomies, where the gesture of a hand, repeated now with love instead of anger, can bring a renewal of life to the living and the dead. Which, so
I'm kind of riffing on this really beautiful teaching on healing that's one of my favorites from the whole tradition, and it comes on the Exodus story, and it's after all of the drama and the harshness of the servitudes of slavery and the plagues and all the all of the unfolding, and they arrive at the moment where the people are going to cross the sea. They're about to cross the sea. The Egyptian army is behind them, and the sea is in front of them. And when we were kids, my folks, for when we did our Passover Seders, they would like take us down to the beach. We would be at the beach in Miami, and we would go do the beginning of the Passover Seder at the ocean. And my folks would say to us, look, pretend you're the Israelites, and the water's right there, and the Egyptian army is right there. What do you do? What do you do? And the text has Moses like raising up his arm, right? Moses raises his staff, and the sea parts. And this commentary in the tradition says, when Moses raises his arm, they shoot you back hundreds of years to a completely other place in the text, to the moment when Abraham raises his arm to slay his son Isaac. Imagine the trauma that was instilled in the generations of a father who tried to kill his son. In the Jewish textual tradition, Isaac is like a being of trauma. The teachings say that he went blind, that the angels were crying and their tears dripped into his eyes, and he went blind because he couldn't see a world where parents would do that to their children. And so Isaac is the symbol of woundedness that goes through. But then this moment of Moses raising the staff, and that the same physical gesture goes back and heals backwards. So I love that teaching because, humanity has enacted, really horrific, and we still are, we're watching what's unfolding in Ukraine. Like, humanity continues to enact profound woundedness on each other. But this notion that we can heal, and the healing, of course, benefits our children and the generations to come, but it echoes backwards in a way. I find that notion beautiful and comforting.
Zach, I'd like to just quickly before I forget, certainly interested in this, the idea of the Exodus, of course, being fundamental to Jewish identity, and then the Exodus story also being fundamental to Black theology as well. But I'm going to hold that for a second and just ask a question about something you said earlier, where you said it almost in passing, that you did not have any racial education growing up in the Jewish community. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, that evening when we gathered at the synagogue, I don't know how. I think I had read a bit of James Baldwin, but not enough, and I think a lot of people have dug into his literature in the last couple of years, myself included. And there's a really profound essay written, I think, in 1959, kind of addressed to the Jewish community, or referencing the relationship between the Black and the Jewish community, on anti-Semitism from within the Black community. And the essays, if he's got this association with fire, you've got to be ready to dig into Baldwin. And I was at the time, and, but congregants, I think that's kind of the work of clergy. We have to be eager to dig in, and congregants sometimes move at their own pace. And I mean, that's again, the question of healing and pace and when it's happening. So, but in this essay, Baldwin basically is really, really hard on the Jewish community, saying, look, you had all the experiences of oppression. You knew what it was like, and yet you chose whiteness. You didn't have to. You chose to take on whiteness as you came to America, and this is my great-grandparents and great-grandparents from Eastern Europe, from Ukraine, from Poland. Baldwin's saying, you could have chosen not. You didn't have to. And that's why, we're angry and there's dissonance, and because you could have been our companions in fighting white privilege, but instead you took on white privilege. I mean, so to answer your question directly, Amos, it just wasn't spoken about. I mean, I think there were a lot of barriers put up, so that most of your interactions were within the Jewish community, like even just kind of all of the practical stuff of holidays and rituals and eating habits, stuff like that. And kind of, I grew up Orthodox, kind of very traditional, and made my way like out of it, not because a lot of the practices aren't beautiful, but to me, from an early age, from 11, 12, I saw that there was this kind of superiority complex to the Jewish community that was like, we're better. Even if it was out of having been persecuted so much, you had to develop kind of that thing. I was like, this can't be true theologically. I had a kind of theological mind from very young, and I couldn't buy it. I couldn't buy a theology that privileged peoples. And so I moved further and further away from that kind of traditional religion because of that reason.
That's helpful. Thank you for that clarity, because when you said it, I thought like, okay, you didn't have any racial education because race was the Jewish community. In your Jewish community, everyone believed that race was just like was a construct that was just developed and actually didn't exist. Like, I didn't know if you were talking about just race, period. But what I hear you saying is that you didn't have any, like, you didn't learn about the civil rights movement, for instance, right? Or the history of Black Americans here in the U.S. Is that right?
I don't think so. No, I went to public high school, so like by the time I got to you know as I'm saying, I think as a kid, and I mean, this is also an interesting question of it. At what ages are different kind of
Yeah.
educations offered? Like, what are we introducing and at what point? And so as a young kid, I think some of these, especially this kind of Jewish question of both being oppressed but also benefiting from white privilege is a complicated thing that, takes a good education even for the teacher to have before they're
Right.
going to give it to the kids. And so some of what I think I was speaking to was, being a young kid, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and having eyes, but nobody's talking about the things,
Right. Yeah.
so you're starting things are coming in, but with no discussion. And
Yeah.
I guess you're taught then that, that's what we do. We don't talk about those things.
Right, which is traumatic in and of itself, right? The secret keeping, right, is indicative of a communal trauma. And in fact, I would say, Zach, I had the same experience as a young kid. I mean, it wasn't just school, but even at home. I mean, in my culture, we're very reticent, to discuss things that might disturb the status quo.
When you say my culture, what do you mean by my culture?
Ethiopian Oromo culture. Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, I think it's, beautiful, this particular work that you guys are doing, but like that's what we're all gonna, anybody who's working to fight on these fronts and to engage and to heal, it's like it's subjects that weren't given spotlight, for, I don't know, ever maybe, and so it's.
Yeah.
I mean, and so it's so interesting because as for each one of us who, and there are even stats around how, racial violence or, any kind of a particular hate crime, like we are part of a group where hate crimes are perpetrated against. I had the same experience as you all, where it was not talked about when I was younger, right? It wasn't like you are different. I was never told you are different than other people or notice this about yourself. It was just work really hard. And the differences I observed internally, because like you couldn't not see them, but there wasn't language around it. Whereas my children right now are, my daughter just did a presentation in 2nd grade on somebody for Black History Month and is asking questions around her own racial makeup, right? Which I have to talk to her about what it means to be biracial. But I never had that conversation as a child, which is just kind of profound for the three of us that didn't happen.
Actually, I probably did have that conversation at church, just not with the, like, did not properly in that, at church, we sing that song, remember? Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. And then all the colors, right, that come afterwards. And so there's, in church, we were actually taught I would say my parents to some degree, like, as a lot of parents did, subcontracted, those kinds of conversations to our faith communities. But the way we had those conversations in church, the learning that happened was always intended to kind of like level out difference, as opposed to, understand.
Celebrate it.
So, and celebrate it.
But. Are there things, like, is this work entering the religious space? I mean, I guess this is religious space as well, but are things happening inside of, like, one of my areas of interest is kind of ritual and rituals of healing, so I'm interested if any of that is happening.
This is, this is a ritual, once a month we get on here, we do this conversation, and we invite somebody to join us, and we invite others to participate by listening. And that's what happens for the most part with the community that gathers. We're listening, and a lot of folks don't, the majority of people aren't turning in, they're not asking questions. We'll get a couple responses via email after each one of these podcasts, but I sense, especially as this has gone on, Charlene mentioned that it's been a year since we started doing this, that this is this is as much a ritual of healing as it is one of teaching or education or information sharing. So this is one of them, I would say.
I mean, I think for the two of us, but communally speaking, honestly, I think that's what I find so beautiful about the work that you're doing and the work that you have been involved in. And it's something that I actually covet in the Jewish tradition, in the intense and relentless and the faithful, committed ritualizing of pain and suffering as a people, right? So we're heading into Holy Week, and we're going to ritualize Jesus's suffering on Good Friday. But as a community, there aren't as many models or examples of how we do that really well. I mean, for First Pres Berkeley, they did a service of lament after George Floyd's murder, but it's not built into the system in a way that there's opportunities for your soul to kind of get that. And I'm feeling that myself, because a year ago, our first episode was centered around the shootings in Atlanta, with the 6 Asian women who were shot in Atlanta. And a year later, there was the beating of the woman in Yonkers in New York City, hit 125 times over the head. And I realized, like you were talking about, the hand motion of Abraham's hand versus Moses's hand, and how it heals backwards because it's different. And I realized that after I read on the New York Times, much like I read about the shooting in Atlanta, I was like, oh my gosh, I feel it again. And which makes me realize, I haven't resolved or healed. It just was put on pause so I could function throughout the rest of my life for the past year. But here we go again. Like no time has passed, that fear, that pain, that sorrow, that all those things. And so I really am, all that to say is, I think your question's the right one. And I'm hoping actually that you can really bring us some wisdom on this, Zach. I think we've been, as a Christian church, I would say one thing that we're really good at ritualizing is confession. We've talked a lot about, let's confess and let's lament. But I do think that if we stay in this place and don't actively pursue healing, this confession, the act of confession itself, will be only for the benefit of the people who confess. Like, healing is for the entire community. And we actually just got this question in the chat: is what is how can we apply the wisdom of healing backward? Like, what could that look like?
You guys are catching me at a time where some of our own kind of inner family traumas are playing out. I'm not going to go into details out of respect for my family members, but one of the contexts I wanted to bring, because I thought it was really intriguing, and that I'm doing the work myself, as we're speaking, and I actually, had a heavy day inside. That I think there's a few different contexts of healing. Like, in addition to the social spaces that we're speaking about, we're all born into families, right? And the parental relationships and the sibling relationships, some of the those are the first experiences of both love and woundedness that we have. And so the toolkits of healing that we're given, if anything, are what we got, as kids. And so that's kind of one context that I want to put on the table. The other one that I've thought about sometimes, and it's a little more complex theologically, but I'm excited to get to share it with you guys, is that when a human being is born, right? A human being is born, and I don't know if this is you'll tell me if there's a Christian parallel, but there's like some Jewish mystical concept of that the soul is plucked off from God, right? The soul is separated from God, and when a person dies, the soul will go back to God. But the in between, there's a separateness, there's a woundedness, there's a brokenness that's never healed. There's like a hole, and prayer and love and works, these things can be addressed to that. And that's one of the most beautiful ways to be in relationship to that wound, because you can try to fill it with other things, my teacher says, with sex, with drugs, with food. None of those things ever work. The only things that really speak to that wound are prayer activities. So we've got cultural healing that we're trying to do. We've got the familial moment, and we've got this divine soul thing happening. And I think those are all happening inside of us when we're trying to heal. And sometimes we don't even know how any of that kind of triangulated thing are speaking to each other, And so I was trying to untangle some of that in myself today, and I want to share this one concept and see what you guys think of it. And it actually, it's gonna be a Jewish interpretation of Jesus. So you tell me if I do okay with this. I think there's a human sense that we want to be healed. We want to feel whole. We want to feel complete. We want to feel at peace. And I was recalling, something in the tradition. I couldn't remember the source, where like one of the prophets says to God, I'm looking for wholeness, and God is like, in this life you don't get that. That's not what this life is. When you get to heaven, you'll get peace and wholeness and healing. But in this world, it's not that. This life is the experience of brokenness, of separateness. And I was thinking about Jesus in anticipation of our conversation. And what's really intriguing is that in Judaism, we don't quite have this really beautiful symbol of the human and the divine meeting, that a being can be divine, whole, and human, broken at the same time, and that the brokenness and the wholeness can coexist. And you can be okay with that. You can yearn for wholeness even while saying we remain broken, and that the brokenness is part of the thing. And so I was sitting trying to do this work, saying, with a person who, just keeps, wounding me again and again in a way that is so painful. And I feel like the person's lying to me and trying to cover it up and not apologizing. And the work I was doing today was just, maybe my work is to just to know that they're coming from a deeply wounded place, and to not yearn for perfection, to just be able to receive their actions as they're yearning for love. They're just not able to say it that well. So those were my day's meditations.
I mean, that's so, again, the layers that the overlaps was the word that you used earlier. That is profound to me, because I think Jesus is quite clear about that in scripture as well. Like this existence was not supposed to be rainbows and unicorns and sunshine and cotton candy. There is this rift, this brokenness, all of these things. And I wonder if actually for Christians, because that we have this symbol of the unity between our brokenness as humans and God's wholeness as divine, we expect and demand wholeness. We, you know, I mean, if anything, if there are services of wholeness, or we want peace, dear God, give us peace. And what you're saying is like, well, first, manage your expectations. Like, I mean, just by the mere fact that we are in a very real sense separated from our creator, holistic peace is not going to happen. And so then there's like the nihilistic part of me, then it's like, what that I'm sure also that a lot of people will go into, then it's like, then what's the point? What are we doing? And is it just to get closer to, proximity to, filling that hole as you were describing it? I think it's really profound, because I think, without meaning to, I think you actually took to task what I often see in Christian spirituality, which is entitlement. But I want to feel better now, and not just better. I want to feel completely better. And right now, wouldn't God want that for me? Right? Like, God loves me, ergo, da.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some of the conversations we've gotten to have, that maybe the most significant conditions of healing, maybe the most significant condition of healing is the truth telling of the wounds that were enacted, right? You know, and you know, so if you're not willing to sit and paint in detail the barbarities, you know, and the pains that were enacted, that for sure is being willing to sit in brokenness and own it, and it's very painful, you know. So for sure, that's condition one, you know, that the truth and the stories and those need to be shared and held. And go ahead, Amos. No.
But then I would ask, so this is what I have heard from a lot of my friends of color, is how many times do I have to bear witness to that pain? What happens next? And where's my healing? So I think the more colloquial term is like a vulnerability hangover. It's like you kind of stand out in front of the community and you're like, here are the wounds that I've borne. But there is, again, like I said, for the Christian tradition, there's a lot of ritual around confession, but it's like, I think where we're kind of stuttering these days is like, so then where's the healing or the...
Well, kind of the source of my question, or the investigations today, were this distinction between when you have a partner in healing and when the partner is not really present, you know. And I think it's a worthwhile distinction. When you got a partner in healing, you know, there'll be stumbles, there'll be bumps, but there's this like mutual intention to get past the roadblocks and the blind spots that we all have, you know. And if that's there, then that path is, to me, clearer in some ways. The harder one, this kind of sitting inside of brokenness and wholeness, came out of when you're in contexts of healing where you don't feel met, you know. And what does it mean to do, how much work can we do inside of ourselves on our own when we don't feel met?
If it's okay, I want to just make a slight shift and ask a question, Zach. Something Charlene and I were discussing earlier, and in the last year, there's been a 275% rise in anti-Semitic violence, and then there has also at the same time been a 361% rise in violence towards Asians. So my question is, where do you see racism and anti-Semitism converging and also diverging?
Okay, I hope I don't get in any trouble. I mean, clearly because of um, being a rabbi and the uniqueness of our each of our stories, I've been very caught up with the anti-Semitism piece on this one, and there's been really kind of profound and hard uh, debates in the community. So I'll speak to that first, and maybe we'll find the meeting point thereafter. I question the numbers. You know what? This rise and that rise. Maybe I don't question the numbers, but I question the use of the numbers. And from what I saw inside of the Jewish community, that most often the use of the numbers was on the occasion of these wars in Israel. And what was happening was, you had this very sophisticated army that was killing children in Gaza. You had a horrific war being fought, and there's, the history is long and complicated and detailed, and that's what everybody says. But there was, the scales of the violence is that there were, a couple of deaths in Israel, and there were many, many deaths and much violence in Palestine, and it just felt like this, it didn't. And so some of the rise in anti-Semitism, some of the use of the numbers and the claims was around the time that there were very, that the pro-Palestinian protests really rose in a way. I think the awareness of the Palestinian cause has grown, inside of this racial reckoning that America is going through. It's like we're saying, okay, there's police violence here in America, and we're now, if you watch any of the channels on Palestine and Israel, you see the same thing going on over there. So, so what I really, really dislike is when claims of anti-Semitism are used as defense of violence being perpetrated, in Israel. That's what I see that's really wrong. I hope I said that clear enough. But, on the other side, like we hit earlier, that the fear of anti-Semitism amongst the Jewish community is very profound, and it runs very deep. And so people are really, really scared. And so other people see the uptick in the numbers, and they really, it changes how they live. And again, if we're really honest around different privileges, no one would assume I was a rabbi walking down the street. People wouldn't even assume I was Jewish. I don't, my brother-in-law wears a kippah, wears, a Hasidic outfit. And so, when there's an uptick in violence, the people that are threatened are the people that outwardly, look Jewish. So, to get back to your question just a little bit, and then we'll get Charlene's response. I trace all of the isms to, this innate fear of the other. We're animalistic at the core, and we're concerned, and we group into tribes based on similarities, that are, I don't know how significant they are. We tribe up for the sake of protection, but the spiritual path is to learn how to extend your compassion to all human beings, to work on practicing the diminishment of your fear that separates based on, how a human being looks. And each of the isms has, particularities to the stories that are also, they're beauties. Like there's so many beauties from the Jewish tradition, and the unique wounds of hatred and violence against Jews. Like these are the lights and the shadows of the same thing, but I, I trace them all to this kind of innate human fear that we have to address. That's what it means to be a spiritual being.
I mean, and what I love is so rich in Jewish text and the text that we share as Jews and Christians um, is such an intentional outward call then to embrace the alien, the outsider, the other, right? It's not like an assumption or like it's not subtext. It is blatant in there. And Jesus expounds on that as well. Like that is the through line throughout our sacred texts. And so you're exactly right. I mean, I'm still kind of just sitting on that word, having a partner in healing. I realized, because that is, I mean, that's the thing is like, I think what's happening right now, at least in the church, is a game of catch up. And so a lot of stories are being told, but the partnerships haven't been created. And so it just feels like information is being pushed out when you're exactly right. It's symbiotic. It's not transactional. It is painstaking and it takes time, and it's going to take a cost to your own soul to give someone else a piece of their soul back. And so, I mean, in terms of the rise in the Asian hate crime, I mean, in those moments, again, I mean, because you stepped out first, Zach, and just such honest vulnerability, I'll do the same. Like when that happened, I just felt so utterly alone in my fear. And healing for me, a partner came for me in the most unexpected person. One of my Black coworkers came up to me and he said, you know, that the person who did that was a Black man, right? And I was like, yeah, I saw that in the news. He said, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that happened. And I said, me too. Like, I'm so sorry that our communities are now even more distanced from each other. And like, we just hugged and held each other and cried because we knew what the cost was going to be, that Asian people are now going to be more afraid of Black people. And the division, you know, whatever the direction is going to happen in the other way. Like it was just, it was an actual partner in that moment because that person gave something of themselves. He said, sorry. He didn't do anything wrong. He wasn't the person who did that. I wasn't the woman in Yonkers. Like, and yet I think in that moment, we didn't feel so alone. And I mean, and so I'm kind of now really curious as to like what true partnership looks like.
I think also, Charlene, as I hear you, healing is relational, you know, and so that having to be alone in healing work sometimes, you know, whether it's with family or it's something on a larger scale is really hard. I think there's work to be done there also. It's like sometimes, you know, if somebody shows up to heal and they haven't done any self-reflection and haven't owned anything, that feels icky too.
Yeah.
You know, there's a great little story that I'll share that maybe will contribute to the moment a little bit. There's it's a folk tale, actually comes from Ukraine. There was a famous rabbi, his name was Nachman of Bratslav. He tells this story that there was a prince that thought he was a rooster, and the king is very worried about his son who's convinced he's a rooster, and he brings, you know, all the doctors and all the healers, and nobody can heal the prince from thinking he's a rooster. And then the last healer shows up and says to the king, give me 3 days with the prince and nobody bother us and let us do our thing. And he goes into the prince's room, and the prince doesn't have any clothes on, is under the table clucking like a rooster. And the healer goes in, takes off his clothes, gets under the table, and begins clucking like a rooster. And the next day, he gets up and he puts on his shirt, and the prince says, well, roosters don't wear shirts. And the healer says, well, I'm a rooster and I'm going to wear a shirt. And so the prince puts on his shirt also. And the next day he sits down and has a meal at the table. And the prince says, roosters don't eat at the table, we eat under the table. And the healer says, I'm going to eat at the table. And the prince sits down and eat at the table. And that's how they go out. They go out because he was willing to be inside of whatever the pain and the place that he was at.
I think that's such a beautiful, it's like silly to think about. And I love that it's silly because
it's good for the kids too. You tell that to the little kids, they go nuts, and you have to like balk and clock like really loud, like be calm, and then you go in and then you start clucking and clucking, the kids go nuts.
But it's so profound, right? Like not the healer or the doctor saying, come on under reason, like you're the prince, da, 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 da. It's like, okay, I'm gonna strip naked and make myself the fool with you so that we can do this together, right? Like talk about humility. Zach, I feel like it's kind of crazy that I've saved it 12 years later to share that maybe not in that most extreme, but when we were in Israel, and it really was, gosh, so much tension. And this was back in 2009. It was either the Black seminarians versus the white seminarians, or the Black seminarians versus the Jewish seminarians, or the Orthodox seminarians versus the Reform seminarians. And there was just so much. And I remember in Yad Vashem talking about understanding the fear and likening it to my own experience with how Korea is essentially in a perpetual state of ceasefire and war. And how one of the participants said, don't you ever try to equate our experiences. Don't you ever. And I was trying to do that actually to say like, oh, I understand even just a fraction of the fear now because of the way that it's been explained. And so I think what was the scariest thing about my experience there was realizing, was feeling like I didn't have any partners in my processing except for you. And you created such space just to teach me about the Jewish experience, to listen to my experience every step of the way. You acknowledged and honored and held sacred my humanity. And so I can genuinely say that you have modeled that kind of healing partnership for me. And so I feel really kind of just grateful that I get to show you up to the church, to my church, to Amos's church, especially since people have said, oh, that quote was so beautiful. I love that I get to now show your face to my community and say, this is my rabbi who models for me such a beautiful partnership. So I just thank you for your time and giving us so much wisdom this evening. And I hope that we can continue to be in partnership. Even your reflection on Jesus was so profound for us as our churches are on this holy journey of Lent right now. So thank you for meeting us where we are at as well. I find that incredibly honoring of you. So thank you for being you.
Thanks for having me. It's such a big joy. And I find that when there's so much to learn from, I think there's so much alike about us as human beings, and we all have such wildly different experiences of humanity, and you can put those next to each other. There's so much to learn from each other. Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you so much.
Folks, we have 2 more This is Crucial episodes for the rest of this kind of program year. Amos, why don't you tell us about the next guest?
Next guest, April 24th, we'll come back together. Our guest will be Dr. Willie James Jennings. He's a New Testament scholar, and he's also author of several books concerned with some of the questions that we have been talking about here. This is Crucial, and I'm excited for him to be with us in just about a month.
And then on our May This Is Crucial episode is actually going to be live in Berkeley. It's going to be with Amos, myself, Molly Basquette of First Congregational Church in Berkeley, and David Vasquez Levy, president of Pacific School of Religion. And so we're going to talk about the future of faith in a live panel event. So those in Berkeley will get to attend in person, and Dallas, we will stream it for you as well. And so this partnership continues. Zach, thank you for giving us language around that. And friends, we're grateful for you all, especially you discussion group folks who are continuing this conversation. This conversation is meant to be a very small step in this journey each month. And so we hope that you are taking your steps in the weeks that we aren't meeting like this, and that know that we are praying for you and rooting you all on wherever you are feeling your humanity tender and real in this moment. So thank you all for being here. Have a good night.